Talking with Marshall Eizenga. He's a co-director of Kerith Creek Ministry Retreat Center, part of the Kerith Retreats. That's a ministry arm of Focus on the Family aimed at providing retreats for pastors, missionaries, and parachurch leaders. We're talking today, Marshall, because of a sad story out of the United States. A megachurch pastor, Andrew Steckline, died by suicide. It's really rocking. Well, I've noticed in all the pastor groups that I'm in on social media and stuff, it's really hitting close to home, especially for a lot of pastors. I think it's resonating deeply that this is something a lot of pastors struggle with a lot more than people think. Pastor Andrew, he just returned 2 weeks ago from a 4-month sabbatical. His leadership encouraged and helped him take a 4-month sabbatical to try and deal with anxiety and depression that he'd been dealing with. He'd been very open with it with his congregation. He just preached a series on it.
Wow.
And, you look at him on social media, he's young, he's a pastor of a mega church, he has a wife and 3 beautiful children, and yet the reality was he was struggling. Maybe help our listeners understand, what it is that pastors are facing and help us understand, they're susceptible to these struggles too, just like everybody else, and maybe why you think that might be.
Well, I think there's, it's a multifaceted answer. But one of the thends that, and it's a statement my wife has made, she looks at pastors as being first responders. And you end up dealing with people in crisis times, and so you can be overwhelmed by some of that. And it was fascinating. Even as I say that, I'm reminded of one of the ladies in our congregation. We pastored for 35 years, and now I'm not pastoring anymore. But along the way, a lady asked my wife if she could take her for coffee, and so Mary said, "Oh, yeah, for sure." And while having coffee, the lady said to her, "I was in church Sunday, and I just felt the Lord say to me, I want you to look around the congregation and think of all the pain there is in this room, of all the struggles, of all the things that are happening in people's lives that Mary and Marshall know about, and they carry them because people have gone to them." And she said, "I looked around, and I kept looking around, and not that I needed to know anything, but I realized that there was a lot of hurt, there was a lot of pain." And she said, then I realized that service would empty and more people would come into that sanctuary and it would fill again. And she said, I felt the Lord just say to me, I want you to pray and just pray for protection and just pray a covering over them. Will you covenant with me to do that for your pastor and his wife? Well, when she told Mary that, Mary started to just, that just kind of broke her. Because you do carry a lot. People come to you with a lot of things. There's a clinical psychologist in the States, his name is Chuck Hannaford, and he said that pastoring, his definition of, not definition, but he calls pastoring a dangerous job. He said because there's so much happening in a church in terms of knowing what's happening in people's lives, and at times you can do something, but many times you really can't do anything. And what happens then as well is that for pastors, you have to deal with failure. Just think of what takes place. The pressure to perform on a pastor is incredible because, you can listen to your radio station. Who knows how many different men across North America. And so when you have to stand up in your pulpit and preach, the pressure to perform and have a sermon every Sunday that's at 10 is, that can be a lot of pressure on somebody.
People never understood when I was pastoring full time, but I made myself unavailable on Sundays. Literally most Sundays I went home to my basement and I curled up on my couch and my wife made me a grilled cheese sandwich almost every Sunday and I just laid there in the dark and I recovered. It's a stressful, pressure-filled thing, that expectation to perform.
Yeah, one of our guests at a Kerith retreat said she said about this, and she was talking about her husband. She said, I look at it like PMS, and we all went, what?
Yeah.
She said it's post-message syndrome.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can go be so emotionally high, intellectually high, in terms of getting ready to preach, and then you preach, and then you crash. Well, I worked with a guy who he had PMS every Monday morning. It was like, okay, I'm going to resign. I can't handle this.
Yeah.
And so you add into that things such as church conflict. You add into that, if there's disappointment and discouragement that happens on a continual basis, pastors who, they become depressed. Who do they talk to? They feel isolated. They are there for others, but sometimes some pastors can't get past the point of the fact that they need somebody to talk to. They need to be able to deal with the situation that's going on in a way that they can pour out their heart to someone. And if they feel that, they have to be strong for everybody else and can't show any weakness, that can be, that can be devastating on them. They want to try to be this good role model. And if they can't, then where do they go and what do they do? And how do they process? What's fascinating is that two professors out of Arizona State University, as they wrote about suicide and people who attempt suicide, they said that what they're finding is that people aren't as resilient today. They're not able to recover post-adversity.
Huh.
And that goes in line with another thing that I read on BBC.com, and it was some Americans they had interviewed. And the American research people, I think one of them was from the CDC, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, they said that we need to teach people to cope with loss. Well, if we need to teach people to cope with loss, we need to teach pastors how to cope with loss, because in pastoring, your losses can be astronomical. It can feel that way at times. If people are leaving your church, it could be for good reasons. They may be moving, but if you're losing people who have been a support to you, or they've been a backbone in some ministry, and maybe a job takes them to another city, or something happens in the church, and they just, we just need something else. There's a lot of losses that have to be processed.
And it feels often in those losses that you go through, it's all your fault when you're the pastor, right? Everybody else might not be thinking that, but that's what it feels like to yourself often as a pastor. It's your fault. You brought this on. You failed not only the church then, but you failed God somehow, which is a lie, but it's what we believe, I think.
It's true. That's perfect. That's a great way to say it. And what happens, sadly, is that if you start going down that road where you're the one who's at fault, you can really, that thought can take you to a very dark and negative place.
Yeah.
And you end up believing that you can't cope with what's going on. There's no future. Mayo Clinic actually says that when you believe that you can't cope and that thought begins to dominate your thinking, the Mayo Clinic says that leads to tunnel vision. And that tunnel vision, they went on and said that the only way out is to take your own life. And so, as a man thinks, so is he, the Bible says, and what an impact when you stop and think of the fact that if everything in this church is dependent on me, that if I can't be successful, if I can't be as good as the guy down the road, if I can't have the success the guy down the road is having, then I'm the one who's at fault.
Yeah. Do you think there's also part of it is, I would call it the pressure of calling? Most pastors, right, we feel that we're called by God into ministry, and then that puts an immense pressure on us as well. And we also tell ourselves then that we can't stop, even when we're burnt out and we need to rest. We can't because we're called.
That's so true, because they say, how can I stop? I've got this work that I have to keep doing. And if I stop, I'm giving in. I'm giving up. And, it's Brady Boyd who says that ministry needs margin. And if we don't understand that we need margin, that we need something in our lives that gives us space and a place where we can kind of, just decompress for a little bit, we're in trouble. I was reading yesterday just a blog that Carrie Newhoff, pastor out of Ontario, said. And very, as you may be aware, he was a lawyer before he entered the ministry. And in this blog, it was so funny. I thought, man, that's interesting that I just read that today. He said he was surprised at how intense ministry was from an emotional impact point of view. And it was greater than anything he'd ever experienced. And that caught him off guard. And he had to learn how to deal with the emotions. He had to learn how to cope. And so in terms of the lack of coping ability, that resilience, I mean, I read that statement, I think, here's a man who was a lawyer, and I think that's a pretty intensive job.
Yeah.
And yet he's saying that the emotional impact of pastoring was greater than anything he'd ever known before. And I think people in the congregation, they need to hear a statement by a man who was a lawyer, who became a minister, and they need, that as much as a pastor needs to understand that, hey, I'm carrying an incredible emotional load. I think people in the pews need to understand that as well.
There's something called secondary traumatic stress disorder. Everybody knows about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
Secondary traumatic stress disorder. A lot of the studies been done actually on veterinarians. They deal with it a lot, having to see so much grief with having to put pets down and families in grief and stuff. But it also relates to ministry, again, what you were talking about earlier about ministers and pastors being first responders, and you take all this trauma of other people onto your shoulders, and it can be hard to get that weight off.
It's so true.
What do you think congregants need to know and understand about their pastors, and how can we support our pastors and walk through them and give them space to be honest and transparent about their own struggles?
Yeah, I think that's one of the good things is that, and you just said it there, about helping pastors be transparent. And maybe for a board, it's asking questions. Maybe it's helping pastors understand that there is somebody in the church, or not maybe even in their own church, but just somebody outside of the church that they can talk to. And as a person starts to hear their pastor begin to talk in ways that you think, wow, you're really taking a burden on here. And I think other staff members need to be listening. Boards need to be listening. And beginning to say, okay, I'm hearing something. Can walk me through what I'm hearing, because I'm not really sure that I'm hearing what I want to hear. I'm hearing something that's underlying this. I think that one of the things probably I would say that could help is that people would be more grace-filled. If they didn't like a sermon, let's not be the first to jump on the pastor or send him a note and say, I didn't like that yesterday. You said this. And
yeah.
And so I was listening to so-and-so on the radio, and they said, let's be a little more grace-filled. And maybe there's some things that need to happen within churches where there's just where the kindness level steps up, where people are saying, you're under a tremendous load. What can I do to help? And sometimes it's not asking the question; it's actually thinking through the question. How can I help my pastor?
Yeah, that's often one thing as a pastor, I would always tell people, say, when somebody in the congregation passed away, don't ask that family, what can I do for you? Figure out what you can do for them and then just do it. Because everybody's going to say, call if you need anything, and then you never call, right? And a pastor's going to do the same thing. If you offer that help, they're not going to take it unless you just start doing it.
Yeah. I think people, if they looked around the church and began to say, wow, there's some things that just haven't gone well this year. There's some plans that just didn't come together. And I think in the middle of it, just affirming the pastor, hey, you know what? We're with you. We've got your back on this. We're standing with you. Pastor, we know that you did 3 funerals this week.
Yeah.
That's tough. But it's like that lady who stood in our church during worship and just had the Spirit of the Lord speak to her. She said, okay, I'm going to commit to praying for Marshall and Mary. And, I've said to our pastor, I've said, hey, there's something you want me to pray about, you just send me a text. And I think there's small things like that. The other, sadly, we opened the conversation you and I did about talking about this pastor in the States who took his own life. And sadly, that whole aspect of mental health and the disorder and trying to help people walk through that where they get the help they need, in those cases, it's really, well, you have to be really persistent to make sure that the person in what would be, as they call it, endogenous depression, because of it's an internal cause as opposed to reactive depression where it's an external cause. It's a case of those that are closest to him hopefully staying with him, or her, and saying, hey, are you staying on your meds? And the sad part is that as soon as you say that, there's almost a cone of silence. We don't want people to know that they have to take medication for something that's happening biologically.
Yeah.
And the stress and strain of that, like seriously, if you're a diabetic, we'll give you medication for that. But there's this, what's the word that it's not something we like to say, oh, they're on medication because of some type of disorder, some type of psychosis. And so we label people instead of saying, you know what, people are being treated for all kinds of things. This is something that's beyond this individual's control. They're being treated, and it's working for them.
Yeah, treatment and medication is them taking control.
That's right, yeah.
And being proactive, yeah. And I think I've seen a little shifts, at least anyways, in that thinking. But, yeah, I definitely remember times people struggling and, you just got to pray it out, have faith, right? And
that's, you just hit another point, because there's the belief that everything that's happening that's negative in this realm is a spiritual attack.
Right.
And it's not.
Yeah.
In fact, probably very few times it may be really a spiritual attack.
Yeah, it's simply brain chemistry, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about the Kerith retreats, because maybe somebody's listening and they're like, or they are a pastor that's struggling, or they're a board member and they know a pastor struggling. Kerith retreats really does offer retreat for pastors and their spouses to come and recoup and rejuvenate, right?
Yes. So let me use three words that all start with the letter R to talk about Kerith retreat. It's a place of rest, and we have scheduled times with the couples who come. It's the maximum 4 couples at a time, or it could be a single person. We have singles who come as well. And the rest is that if you're not meeting with us in group sessions, which happen, let's say, every morning, we do 3 private sessions with the pastors who come. But outside of that, it's a time of rest. It's not like a conference where you're running from one thing to the next.
Yeah.
And we're really building rest into the week that the people are with us. What we find happens is that during that time of rest, during the teaching, and we deal with things such as stress, loss, depression, expectations, burnout. We're dealing with these things that are all part of ministry. And as we do, and as people are there, what happens is that the Spirit of God does this wonderful work of recalibrating them. It can be a minor recalibration. For some, it's been a major thing where the Spirit of the Lord has just taken what's been going on in their life and just beginning to refocus them. And what we find is that when people have had a time of rest and there's been a moment or moments of recalibration, they're ready to re-engage into their calling, into their ministry with greater passion, with greater vision, and the ability to dream or dream again. And so this is why we find the retreats are really important, because we just need that time to step away from things that just won't step away from us. But as pastors take that time, they really are. They really come away refreshed and renewed.
And you help to do that too by turn off our cell phones, right? And get rid of all those distractions.
Yeah, we do. We say, look, we don't want you dealing with anything that's work-related. We know that people come and they want to stay in touch with their kids. We get that. But people are good to keep away from the work component, and so that they can really just engage in what this week is all about for them.
Marshall, in closing, maybe there's a pastor listening right now, and they've been struggling in silence, not letting anybody know what's going on inside their mind. What do you say to them?
Well, there's two things I would say to them. One is recognize where you're at, and recognize that the road you're on is not a good road. The other thing I think that they need to do is that there are places that can help, and people say, well, where can I find help? What can I do? And Focus on the Family has an amazing clergy care line where pastors can phone and they can talk to a psychologist, somebody who's been trained as a counselor, and sometimes that person will be able to talk to them right at that moment. Other times, what Focus on the Family head office will do, or the Clergy Care Network will do, is set up a telephone call with a pastor, with somebody that's in his geographical area. Focus on the Family has 250 trained counselors across Canada that they have vetted and found that, hey, these people, they're worthy of us giving out their name and having these people invest in pastors. And it's a free resource. Pastor can talk to somebody for 2, 3, maybe 4 times about the situation. One of the things that even happens is when people have come to a retreat, they recognize that there's something long-term that's been going on in their world, we just say to them, you need to talk to somebody. And sometimes just having somebody sit across the table from you and say, you need to talk to somebody, is enough to get them doing it, because they realize, okay, you know what, I'm not in a good place. I haven't been in a good place for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I want to say this, that if a pastor's listening to me today, pretend that I'm sitting across the table from you, and I'm saying to you, do you think you need to talk to somebody about this? And the chances are they're going to say, yes, I do. Then I would say, go do it.
I know this because I've been in those shoes. If I had a congregant sitting across from me and my coffee table in my office and explaining all these things that I myself was dealing with, I would be almost forcing them to seek professional help. But at the same time, as a pastor, I was so unwilling to get it myself. But yeah. there are so many people out there waiting for you to help.
Yeah. Well, let me just backtrack and just so you understand, or not understand, but just information. I don't know if you'll use this, but one of the things that we do when my wife and I meet with a couple or a single, in the first private session that we have with them, we say to them, tell us your story. And wow, I mean, we get the good, the bad, and the ugly. But that in itself is very cathartic for a person. It can be the start of a healing process for them.
Yeah.
Because when's the last time that a pastor's had somebody say to them, tell us your story, in a setting where they feel, because we don't report to anybody, where they feel they can just be honest and open. And it's amazing what happens, and that really helps people come to an openness about what's going on in their world. And that in itself is incredibly helpful.
I was just thinking, of being, I used to go to a monthly ministerial, and every month it's like, this week I'm going to share open and honestly with them. And then they start going around the table and telling how amazing everything's going, right?
Yeah.
There's this sudden shame. But
Good
again,
point.
and I think that is the point is, what? Your pastor is just like you. He's or she is a human, and she's full of all sorts of emotions and is totally fallible, just like you are. Be gracious, like you mentioned, to them, and be loving, and just support them and walk alongside them.
Yeah.
Marshall, thank you very much.
Hey, well, thank you for the opportunity to chat with the people that listen to your radio station.
You're very welcome.